thank you all for coming out tonight. This topic, redlining, is directly attached to a series that I've been doing called The Hidden Impact of Segregation. And so I'll be sharing with you some of the information from that talk as well. But, you know, when I began this journey looking at these particular issues, segregation, trying to figure out why Milwaukee was the most segregated community in the country, one of the things that I knew a little bit about already was redlining. I'd heard, you know, things about it in the course of my life, but I was absolutely fascinated by the things that I've learned over the last 2 years that I've been doing the research. And redlining is a much more nuanced phenomenon than I thought it was, and so I'm going to share some of that with you tonight because I think it's a fascinating part of our history that most of us don't know enough about to really understand the depths of it. So I'm hopefully going to share that with you all tonight, and you'll have a much deeper understanding of really the impact that redlining had on a variety of different communities around the country. So one of the things that's very interesting now, because of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, is that this type of discrimination in housing is illegal. And the federal government, the Department of Justice, can file lawsuits against organizations and individuals who discriminate. And one of the things that I found is very interesting is that the wording of, you know, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 makes it, you know, a very strongly worded document. But as you'll see tonight, words don't always mean anything. So we can talk about what laws affect discrimination in housing, but I've always believed this, that laws are only as good as the enforcement mechanism behind them. And you'll see tonight that that enforcement mechanism has not been very strong. So redlining is part of what I call the perfect storm. Redlining, racial restrictive covenants, and then real estate policies all combine together to create the segregated space that we occupy today that we call the United States of America. And all three of these have worked kind of intersecting one another and created, really over a period from the 1930s to the 1960s, created the segregation that we see today. It didn't exist, and people wanted it to exist, and people made it happen. And we've been led to believe, most of us have been led to believe, that, you know, people self-segregate, they live where they live because that's where they choose to live. But you'll see that these policies really directly impacted the way people occupy the spaces that they occupy. And I've always said this, I believe this, after doing this research for the last 2 years, that segregation is about a lot more than just the places we live. It's about the spaces we occupy outside of home. So we live in what I call segregated spaces. These segregated spaces are not only the places where we live, but where we shop, where we worship, where we play, all these different spaces. And what ends up happening, to me, the greatest impact of segregation is that it's prevented people from getting to know people of other groups. And because we don't get to know people from other groups, we live our interactions with those people based on the stereotypes we have of them. The information we get from the mass media, from television, from movies, from, you know, the local news, from the newspaper, all these things. And so we don't really get to know people because we don't occupy spaces with people from those groups on a regular basis. And to me, that's the biggest impact of segregation. So redlining is the topic tonight. And this is a very interesting thing that this guy, Josh Begley, did. He looked at these old redlining maps, and what he did was he used some new technology to try to draw what they would look like in modern times. These are the original maps, and these maps were drawn around the country in 239 different cities by the federal government. And so the idea of redlining is the practice of pinpointing certain neighborhoods that receive disparate treatment in mortgage lending, business lending, as well as insurance. And I'll describe exactly how those worked in a moment. And so redlining occurs when financial institutions intentionally refuse to lend in areas that are considered high financial risk, based primarily on the people who live in those areas. And so we'll actually look at a redlining map for Milwaukee that was drawn in 1938 to see exactly how it worked. But one of the things that I found during this research is that redlining is a much bigger topic than just those maps. We tend to associate it with just those maps, but I'm going to show you tonight that it takes three specific iterations. HOLC, which is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, redlining, they are the government organization that created those redlining maps. back in the 1934 to 1940. But we also have bank and insurance redlining that's occurred, and we have what's known as reverse redlining, which is basically a way of talking about predatory lending. And we'll talk about all three of those tonight. So one of the things that I found amazing is that way before these redlining maps were drawn, there were already people who were influencing the way that these policies were developed over the course of time. And some of the people that had really tremendous influence were people who were city planners. And Mr. Park and Mr. Burgess wrote a book in 1926 describing what they considered these big, central cities like Milwaukee and Chicago and Detroit, New York, LA, places like that. They described what these places look like from their perspective. And I found it instrumental in convincing other people to look at cities in the same way. So they described these areas as, deteriorating areas, slums, badlands, all these different derogatory terms about them. And what ends up happening is that became, for the most part, around the country, the way that most people in the industry began to look at these cities. So they began to divide different neighborhoods based on the quality of the neighborhood, as they described it. And so what they did is they gave different levels of valuation depending on who was in those neighborhoods. And that made it very easy for these policies later to come about. The redlining policies, racial restrictive covenants, they fell right in place because the mindset was already there prior to these occurrences. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created in 1933 by the federal government, and they were designed to assist the nation to help recover from the Great Depression. One of the things that happened during the Great Depression, a lot of homes went into foreclosure, and also the federal government recognized that because of deteriorating economic conditions, that a lot of Americans were beginning to lean towards communism. They were beginning to support communism. And so one of the things that they wanted to do was to prevent people from supporting communism. So they said, what better way to prevent people from leaning towards communism than supporting capitalism by becoming homeowners? So that was one of the things that they said. And the others, they said, if we begin to build houses, guess what? That will put people to work. So those were the reasons that they created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to assist people in purchasing homes. Prior to the Great Depression, it was very difficult to buy homes. You typically had to pay 50 to 75% down payment. You typically had terms of 3 to 5 years to pay the mortgage off. It was very difficult, and most Americans could not. The Homeowners Loan Corporation created a new type of mortgage, an amortized mortgage, where you paid part on principal, part on interest, and they extended the terms out to 15, 20, and eventually 30 years to pay off that mortgage. And they allowed people to then to begin to build equity in those homes, and they lowered the down payment significantly. So this was really the beginning of home ownership becoming a regular feature in America, was during this particular time as a result of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and eventually the Federal Housing Administration as well. So these maps that we call redlining maps were officially known as residential security maps. They were drawn in 239 different cities, and they were drawn from 1934 through 1940. And one of the things that I found is very interesting is they were confidential. In fact, no one even knew outside of the industry that these maps existed until the late 70s. Someone discovered some of these in the National Archives, and that's when people started saying, oh, redlining. Oh, they had maps. But during the time that these maps were being used, only people within the industry really knew about the maps. So even though we associate these maps directly with redlining and the policies, what I found is that because the maps were confidential, it didn't matter if you had the maps or not, because the people that helped to draw the maps were the people in the industry. These were the bankers, these were the insurance professionals, these are the real estate agents that helped the federal government to actually draw these maps. So whether they had the maps or not, the policies would have been exactly the same. The maps just helped them to differentiate the neighborhoods in a more clear fashion. So the maps were graded, first, second, third, and fourth grade, and they were color-coded, green, blue, yellow, and red, and then they were given a letter designation, A, B, C, and D. This is a redlining map from Milwaukee that was drawn in 1938. And one of the things that I found when I went to UWM to get a digital copy of this map, as I was leaving, I'm walking out of the space and they're like, did you see the book? I'm like, what book are you talking about? They were like, there's a book. Each map came with a book. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. So I went back and I looked through the book, and the book really is absolutely a phenomenal document that all of you, if you have time, go to the library at UWM, go to the map department, and ask to see the book that goes with the redlining maps. Because what they did is they described each of these areas in great detail. They talked about the conditions of it, how the neighborhood looked, whether there were factories there, the demographics of the people, how much money they made. They told you a little bit of everything about each neighborhood. And there were 19 areas on the map that they redlined. Now, I went into this believing that redlining was simply about drawing, a red area on the map so that black people could not benefit by purchasing homes in the area. But what I found from reading the book that came with this was that the redlining was done in a variety of different ways. Part of the reason certain neighborhoods were redlined was actually because of the conditions of the neighborhood. So if they were big, ugly, polluting factories that were polluting the water next to it, it would be redlined. If they didn't have a modern sewage system, it would be redlined. But there were 3 specific areas in Milwaukee that were redlined simply because of the people who lived in those neighborhoods. And so as they described these in the book, they described those first grade areas, the green areas, as hot spots within the city. They described the second grade attitude or areas as still good. So these were areas that were pretty good. If you lived in the green or blue area, getting a mortgage was a piece of cake. Pretty much guaranteed to get a mortgage. If you lived in the yellow area, it was a little bit harder. They said there was an infiltration of a lower grade population, as they described it. And it was a little more difficult to get a mortgage there, but you still had a decent chance of getting a mortgage. However, if it was the 4th grade and it was red, they described it as detrimental influences, undesirable population, or infiltration of it. And there's absolutely, positively no way you'll be able to get a mortgage in those areas. So what these maps allow people to do, and the policies that came along with them, was they prevented people in areas that were redlined from having the ability to buy a home the way everyone else did. So you could get a mortgage, build equity, build wealth, but if you lived in one of the red areas, and every area that had any black population was guaranteed to be redlined. So even if that population in that area was not completely black, if there was a mixed neighborhood, well, sorry, those white people who live in that neighborhood, you're going to get, the same treatment as those blacks. You will not be able to get a mortgage. So those people were forced to buy homes on what's known as a land contract, which meant that you built no equity in it. And if you paid for 5 years and never missed a payment, you have to start all over from scratch. So it was really, really a very bad deal. So redlining had a huge impact on the capacity of individuals and families to build wealth moving forward. Those people who lived in the areas that weren't redlined were able to purchase these properties, businesses as well as homes, build equity, use that equity, to send their children to higher education, to make repairs on their home, to buy a little cabin up north, to do all of the things that come with the American dream. But those people in the redline areas really did not have the opportunity to do those things. And it led to a tremendous loss of opportunity for the people who were in the redline areas. So we look, these are the 3 areas, and specifically D3. This is an area that's right around where the River West neighborhood is now, was redlined. Area D5 is the area where every black person in Milwaukee lived. And then area D11 on the south side is the area where the Latino population, the Mexican population, was living. So let's look at what the book said about each of these areas. So area D3, and these are the borders of area D3 on the map. It said that there was a Polish infiltration. Imagine that. I remember growing up, I moved to Milwaukee from Mississippi. And when I came to Milwaukee, from 3rd through 8th grade, every school I went to was, completely black. There were no white students in it. But when I went to high school, I ended up going to Milwaukee Tech on the south side. And it was my first time going to school with white students in Milwaukee, even though I had gone to school with white children in Mississippi. Imagine that. But anyway, I remember hearing all of these derogatory remarks about the Polish students. I didn't know, I had no idea what they were talking about. I never knew that people had this type of prejudice against Polish people. But it goes back. It's a long-term prejudice against Polish people. The area they lived in was redlined. The next area that was redlined, D11, was because of what they referred to as Mexicans coming into the northeast corner, this infiltration and they use the word infiltration on a regular basis. And then the last area that was redlined, area D5, this was an area where every black person in Milwaukee, they had to live within the parameters of this. They had no choice. They couldn't live anywhere else. And they described this as the Negro slum area. Each of the pages at the bottom, they had what were known as clarifying remarks. Some of the pages, they had stuff in the clarifying remarks. Some of the pages, they had nothing in the clarifying remarks. On this particular page for D5, in the clarifying remarks, this is what they said. Besides the colored people, a large number of lower type Jews. So we see that redlining wasn't just about black people being discriminated against. We see here in Milwaukee that Polish citizens were redlined. We see that Mexican citizens were redlined. We see that blacks and Jewish families were redlined as well. So redlining was much bigger than what most of us have typically been led to believe in terms of the impact that it had. So these redlining policies prevented people from all of those groups, as long as they stayed in those neighborhoods, from being able to purchase a home and get a mortgage. So it was very, very impactful. I call this whole process the fruit of a poisonous tree. So this perfect storm of greed, entitlement, and racism created separate housing markets and spawned the wealth gap that we talk about today. Most people, when we think about the wealth gap, we're thinking about the size of people's bank accounts or their stock portfolio, their 401ks. Most of the wealth that Americans have is tied up in the homes that they own. So the wealth gap is directly connected to people having properties and the value of that property. So if we look at the things that really kind of impacted this, you know, the Federal Housing Administration, which played the largest role by far, National Real Estate Board, banks, and then insurance companies. They were all in kind of cahoots in this process. They all worked together. They worked in tandem with one another to make sure that we were a segregated society, that we maintained segregated neighborhoods, and that those policies would stay in place decade after decade after decade, regardless of who the players were. The people left those institutions, but new people came in and the policies stayed exactly the same. So the Federal Housing Administration created policies that mandated segregation. And they had the audacity to write it in their underwriting manuals from 1936 until 1950. They used very explicit language to describe exactly what they were doing. They were not ashamed. They were not trying to cover it up. Finally, in 1950, they finally, changed the language so it wasn't so racially tinged, but the policies were still pretty much the same. They were embarrassed because in 1948, a Supreme Court case called Shelley versus Kramer ruled that racial restrictive covenants were no longer legally enforceable, and they were pushing racial restrictive covenants in these underwriting manuals by the Federal Housing Administration. So I want to show you just a few things from that underwriting manual, a few of the things that they wrote in the manual. For instance, they wrote that deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than the zone ordinance in providing protection from adverse influences. When they describe adverse influences, they mean the wrong type of people. So prior to people using racial restrictive covenants, they were using deed restrictions, or they were using zoning laws. So they had zoning laws around the country that said, Jewish people can't live in this neighborhood. Black people can't live in this neighborhood. One of the most famous cases in Baltimore, the Jewish and black population in Baltimore were restricted in terms of where they could live. And as a result, those groups came together. They filed a claim against it, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1917, and they said these are unconstitutional, and those became illegal, and so what took their place were these racial restricted covenants, which we'll talk about shortly. Another thing that they said, that natural or artificial boundaries establish, so they said, look, if we have a little stream or a river or railroad track, those are great. We can use those to kind of isolate people, and they said that those would be really good in protecting the neighborhood from adverse influences, including lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. And they also said if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. These were all in the underwriting manuals that the Federal Housing Administration used from 1930 all the way to 1950 when they finally changed the language and took many of these things out of there. This, to me, is the craziest thing that was in the book. They said that recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances and be really effective should include provisions listed below. And those provisions included prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. This is in the Underwriting Manual for the Federal Housing Administration. And then they went further by saying schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. So not only were they supporting and demanding residential segregation in housing, but they were demanding that it take place within schools as well. So the Federal Housing Administration, out of all of the players that helped to create segregation, they played the biggest role by far. No one else had the influence that they had. They were able to force lenders to follow the protocols that they put in place. So if they demanded that these institutions use redlining, if they demanded that these institutions use racial restrictive covenants, they had no choice, because this is what the Federal Housing Administration did. They said, all of these people that are purchasing homes, we will subsidize that by actually promising to pay 80% if they default. So the people will pay 20% down, and the federal government said, we'll back the other 80%. So they told the lenders, don't worry about lending to these people, we'll back that 80%. If they default, don't worry about it, we got it covered. And so as a result of that, people took advantage of it, these lending institutions, banks and others. They said, okay, we'll take advantage of this. And what ends up happening, the Federal Housing Administration eventually said, but wait, one other thing. If you expect us to back those loans, you have to follow just a few simple rules. One of those rules is that you have to use racial restrictive covenants. Otherwise, we will not back those mortgages. So they instructed financial institutions not to lend to households in integrated or predominantly African American areas. They were very explicit about this. They did not try to sugarcoat it or cover it up or be quiet about it. They were very explicit. They wanted to make sure that black people, in particular, did not have the same opportunities that whites had. So this is the federal government that's doing this. And so state and local governments followed suit as well, and they created policies very similar to the federal government. The biggest tool that was used by far were racial restrictive covenants. These were legally enforceable deeds that were attached to the deed of the property. So when you bought a home, and many of you, if you own a home in this area, more than likely, there's a good chance that the home you own may have one of these racial restrictive covenants attached to it from way back in the 1920s or 1930s when they were written primarily. And what they were documents that were attached that said who could and could not live in those properties. Not only who could and could not live, but who could and could not occupy that particular space. And we'll look at an example of one. They were used around the country until it became unenforceable. Shelley versus Kramer was a famous Supreme Court case in 1948 that said racial restrictive covenants, they're still okay to use as long as it's an agreement between private parties, but we can no longer have the authorities come in and remove people from that property, which is what was being done consistently. So if you violated the terms of the racial restrictive covenants, and they said, Jewish people can't live in this subdivision, and you violated it by selling to a Jewish family, selling to a black family, renting to a Jewish or black family. If your neighbors found out, they could sue you, and you would lose that property, and those people would be removed by the authorities immediately. So the Supreme Court in 1948 said, well, we can't remove those people anymore. So they kind of had, moving forward, this wink-wink agreement that we'll continue to do the same thing. We just won't advertise it. We won't put it on a piece of paper anymore. But the craziest thing about it, and what made them so powerful, was that they ran with the land, mandating each owner after that to abide by those same terms. And then when the Federal Housing Administration began to say, you must use these, you must attach them to every property that we back, you must have a racial restrictive covenant attached to it. It was a done deal then. There was no way you were going to get around it. And even people who didn't want to follow that, they had no choice. This is an example of one that was written in South Milwaukee in 1937. You see the expiration date. It was set to expire in 2024. At no time shall any such lot or any building thereon be purchased, owned, leased, occupied, or used by any person other than citizen of the United States of America of the white race. This provision shall not apply to domestic servants which may be employed by the owner or occupant of any such lot or building thereon. So you see how explicit the language was. They were not trying to, sugarcoat it, cover it up. They were very explicit in their language. These were drawn up by people in different neighborhoods around the country. And for those people that didn't know how to write these, the Federal Housing Administration in 1938, they said, listen, we're going to give you a little assistance. in our underwriting manuals, we're going to give you a copy of one, a template that you can use so you don't have to struggle writing them anymore. And they became the norm around the country. This was how people created existing communities that were white, maintained those as all white communities, and any new communities that were being built were then going to be white communities as well. They were used very widespread here in the local area. A group at UWM in 1979 did a study going through the records downtown, looking at any properties in Milwaukee County that had these, specifically looking at the suburbs. And what they found was that Bayside, Fox Point, Glendale, Greenfield, Hell's Corners, St. Francis, South Milwaukee all specifically excluded blocks with these racially restricted covenants. Cudahy, Shorewood, West Milwaukee, Whitefish Bay, and Wauwatosa have restrictions on any non-Caucasian people. 16 of the 18 suburbs of Milwaukee, so there's 19 cities in Milwaukee County, City of Milwaukee and 18 suburbs. 16 of the 18 use these. The one that used them more than any other was Wauwatosa. They had way more than any other community. And only two cities that they didn't find it in were actually Oak Creek and River Hills. Wow, does that surprise you? They had an impact in the real world because what happens is federal housing administration began to assist people in purchasing homes. And what they did is they made sure that the people who benefited were white people only. So from 1930 to 1950, 98% of the home loans that they backed were to white people only. Blacks who were going to purchase homes were required to pay a higher price to secure less desirable properties. They were trying to move out of overcrowded neighborhoods, so they were desperate to move anywhere they could. And one of the myths of kind of real estate, people talking about location, location, location. One of the myths is that as blacks moved into the neighborhood, everything went down. The property values went down. The exact opposite happened back at this time. There was a thing called blockbusting. You had real estate speculators that would go around to different neighborhoods and they would notice the changes occurring. And they would go to whites and they say, listen, 4 blocks over, the blacks are moving in. It's time for you to sell. You better get out before the prices drop. Sell now. And people were so desperate to make sure that they maintained the value that they sold the homes, and many of them sold the houses for half of what they were worth, just to get out while it was still time, because these people scared them tremendously. So what happens, these whites sold their properties at half of what it was worth in many instances. Then black families came in and they bought them, but they didn't use a mortgage. They used a land contract. And these same people who had just paid a white family, say $5,000 for a $10,000 house, the blacks came in and they charged them $30,000 or $40,000 for that same home. So not only did the property values go up when blacks moved in, they went up tremendously initially. But eventually, more blacks moved into the neighborhood, and they were still restricted to certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods became overcrowded. Many of the people actually came in as renters instead of homeowners. Those neighborhoods became overcrowded, the conditions deteriorated, and eventually the property values did drop. But initially, the property values went through the roof. They underwrote $120 billion in new housing from 1934 to 1962. Over 98% of that went to benefit whites only. So you see the huge impact that this had on people of color around the country. It had just an absolutely, horrible impact, because what it did is it prevented people from moving along on that little treadmill along the same path and the same journey as whites were taking. People of color were not able to jump on that same treadmill. They did not have the same opportunity moving forward to build generational wealth. And that's why we have the conditions that we have today. This goes back a long time ago. The genesis of the segregation that we have, the genesis of the economic disparities that we have go directly back to this. This was the way people moved into the middle class by becoming homeowners. The National Association of Real Estate Boards also played a huge role. They helped to normalize segregation. Their code of ethics, which was basically, every realtor had to put their hand on this book and pledge to abide by the rules of it. And if they didn't, they would lose their license. This is one of the things that was in their book. This was in 1924, and it stayed in the book until the 1950s. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing to a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And that was a rule that they abided by. they began to steer people to different neighborhoods. This was just the norm. Every real estate agent followed this, and it became the way that they helped to promote segregation. So we all know that the Fair Housing Act, which we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of, is coming up soon. April 11th was when the law was signed by President Johnson. It was, debated for 2 years. 2 years they debated this, and Congress couldn't come up with a bill. They finally felt guilt because Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th. 2 days later, they finally came to an agreement. They created the Fair Housing Act. President Johnson signed it, and we're celebrating it. And we do this all the time. We celebrate all of these wonderful things, this moment in time. And I always say, be careful what you celebrate. Because what we're celebrating, it didn't play out the way we were led to believe. Just like we celebrate, the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. All of the books say that desegregated the schools. It didn't. The schools are more segregated now than they were in 1954 in many places. So just because we have a law, it doesn't mean anything if it's not properly enforced. And we're going to look at how it's not been enforced. President Nixon was not a fan of fair housing. And he said so during his campaign. But after King's assassination, he said, okay, I'll support any compromise you guys come up with this bill. And he knew that it was, going to be a contradiction to the views of suburban voters, which he was depending on. But he said, it's okay, I'll go ahead and sign it anyway. And he signed it into law on April, President Johnson signed it into law. President Nixon was supposed to put a mechanism in place to enforce it, but he didn't do so. I'll show you exactly what he did. George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, created a program called the Open Communities Program, where he said, we're going to enforce this law with a hammer. Any communities that are discriminating in housing, we will take federal funding away from any big project that they're doing. So if it's a new power plant that they're building, if it's a new road project, if it's a new sewage project, a new electrical grid, whatever it is, we're going to cut off funding for it. They began to send letters out to different communities around the country telling them we're going to cut off federal funds for any of these projects. All of these people were very alarmed by this, and they contacted the White House. And President Nixon said, I'm absolutely opposed to this. And he went further and he said, knock it in the head now. So he killed it. Almost immediately, Mr. Romney ended up leaving HUD because he was so disappointed that they had the tool that was necessary to prevent continued housing discrimination, and President Nixon killed it almost immediately. So even though we're celebrating this Fair Housing Act, we'll be celebrating it. There'll be big pronouncements and people patting each other on the back about this. But what we don't know is that President Nixon pretty much killed it. So this shows you the inaction of the federal government since then. So from 1969 to 2007, they continued a policy which was pretty much in place since the early 1900s, where no one on the federal level was really concerned about creating open housing. So the first actual federal law to work on housing discrimination or open housing, fair housing, was that act in 1968. There was never anything by the federal government prior to that. There were Supreme Court cases, there were court cases around the country that promoted, fair housing. But this was the first time the federal government said, we'll actually put a law in place to promote fair housing. So from 1969 to 2007, this is what happened. U.S. courts decided an average on only 2 fair housing cases per year. Just 2 per year. Imagine that. We've been led to believe, they jumped right in. And people that were discriminating against, the Department of Justice went in and they threatened these people and they sued these people. They did not. 2 per year on average from 1969 to 2007. The Obama administration, HUD, and the Department of Justice said, okay, we're going to enforce this, in a much more vigorous way than was done before. So they actually doubled the number of cases to 4 per year. Wow, what an improvement, right? But the Department of Justice did not file a single mortgage discrimination claim until 1991. Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. First time the Department of Justice files a claim of discrimination was 1991. So we see this is absolute inaction on the part of the federal government. So redlining continues to this day. Despite federal, state, local laws, one of the things that Dr. Fran says all the time, you can change all the laws you want, but if you don't change hearts and minds, it won't matter. And we have not changed enough hearts and minds. And as a result, redlining continues. Let's look at how it continues. So we have three major forms of mortgage lending discrimination: underwriting discrimination, redlining, and reverse redlining. Underwriting is when a lender denies credit to a prospective non-white borrower while extending it to similar credit-worthy white borrowers. So it's blatant. A white person gets the loan, a black person, Latino person, Asian person. Same credit worthiness, they don't get the loan. Another way is a lender refuses to extend credit to non-white majority geographic areas while extending it to otherwise similar white areas. So once again, you pick a neighborhood, we're not going to loan to people in these neighborhoods. Even though it's completely illegal, they're still doing it to this day. And then reverse redlining is when a lender charges higher interest rates and or fees to non-white borrowers relative to a similar creditworthy white borrower. So these are the ways that redlining continues in our society this day. So insurance redlining, there was a famous case in Milwaukee which we'll describe shortly. The term insurance redlining describes the practice or policy of refusing to write an insurance product or varying the terms of an insurance product because of the geographical location of the property, because of the racial or ethnic composition of the area. Insurance companies around the country have done this consistently year after year. They will offer you insurance, but you're going to pay a whole heck of a lot more than someone in a white neighborhood. You're not going to have the same terms. And there was a famous case in 1998. This company in Richmond, Virginia, they were sued by the federal government, and they have to pay over $100 million for doing exactly that, discriminating by making people pay higher fees and insurance rates. Milwaukee, there was a very big case here in Milwaukee. Some of you probably remember this. How many of you remember the headlines that talked about American Family Mutual Insurance Company, redlining? You guys remember that case? It was a very big case. They were forced to pay over $16 million for providing blacks with inferior policies and those offered to whites, and in some cases simply refusing to insure homes for African Americans. Just blatantly discriminating and didn't really care. They got away with it for a significant amount of time. So the evidence in the case include things such as this: handwritten orders that were written that said, quit writing all those blacks. Another person wrote, most blacks have financial problems to some degree. This was some of the evidence that was found by the authorities when they began to investigate these claims by people in Milwaukee. A private fair housing group in Milwaukee in 1986 decided to conduct these tests of 3 large insurance companies. They used paired testers posing as homeowners, seeking insurance, and a total of 60 tests were conducted. And what they found was that blacks and whites and Asians and Latinos were treated differently. White people, when the agents talked to them, they requested the names of the callers nearly 92% of the time, but only about 78% of the non-white callers were asked their name. They asked detailed information about the current policies they had in 92% of the case for whites, but only about 2/3 of the cases for non-whites. They offered minimum type of inspection to 44.4% of whites, but only about 16% of non-whites were offered this inspection. So the inspection would determine, really the value of the home. And so they didn't do that for these people of color, and that allowed them then to charge higher rates for a house that maybe wasn't as valuable as these other houses. And then when a more rigorous inspection was to be required by the company, they did so in 55.6% of the white houses, but they required 84.2% of non-whites to have this rigorous inspection done to determine whether or not they would give them insurance. So obviously they were discriminating in a very large way, and they were caught red-handed by doing so because of these paired testers. The complaint filed with the U.S. District Court alleged that they did these things. Now imagine this: they gave explicit instructions to agents and underwriters to consider race in deciding whether or not and on what terms they offer homeowners insurance. So they basically said, listen, make sure that you consider the race of the person when we're looking to underwrite these insurance policies. Make sure that you take that into consideration, because we're not going to treat everybody the same. In addition to that, they required agents and underwriters to consider race as a factor in deciding whether to inspect a home, the results of which were used to deny coverage in some cases. So they would go out to the homes of people of color, they would inspect and say, oh, sorry, your house is in bad shape. Sorry, we can't insure this home. And they did it on purpose. They overlooked deficiencies and conditions of homes in white neighborhoods that were used to deny coverage in black neighborhoods. So there were houses in white neighborhoods that had all kinds of issues. They still got the insurance policies. Black, Latino neighborhoods, homes with the same exact issues. Sorry, we can't issue a policy. You have, something wrong with the chimney. Oh, your roof is in bad shape. Sorry, we can't offer you a policy. So they were very blatant and discriminating. In addition to that, they made disparaging and stereotypical references about African Americans as being poor insurance risk, criticized agents, including African American agents who had the audacity to do business in the African American community, discouraged them from continuing to do business. So any agents who actually were like, listen, man, I'm not going to discriminate. I'm going to treat everybody the same. They made disparaging remarks about these, including those black agents who had the audacity to treat black people fairly. Like, how dare you treat your people fairly? We want you to discriminate just like everybody else at the company is doing. And this was evidence that they found. However, the difficulty in housing discrimination complaints is that it's very difficult to prove. Unless the people are so blatant, as that company was, it's very difficult. So most Fair Housing Act cases have relied on circumstantial evidence or proof of defendant's discriminatory motive. Proving intent is extremely difficult. There was a famous case in 1974 where an insurance company, or actually a lender, said, we are going to allow black people to rent. A black family came in and they said, we want to rent this house. And the agent told them, okay, great, no problem, we'll let you rent. But just to let you know, up front, you're going to pay 50% more than a white family would pay in the same house. That's how blatant they were. And the family's like, oh, really? Wow, thank you for telling us. You didn't put that in writing? Oh, yes, of course. Here's our policy. They had it was a written policy. So guess what? The family went and they filed a complaint, and the other companies learned, well, maybe we shouldn't be so blatant. Let's not put it in writing. Let's not tell them right to their faces that we're discriminating. So that made it so that it's very hard to prove that people are doing these things intentionally. There was a major shift in redlining cases after the Great Recession in 2008 to 2009. The Obama administration came in and began to enforce open housing laws in a much more vigorous way than had been done before. Now, this is one of the things that really surprised me when I looked at how these things were handled. Prior to the Obama administration coming in office, regulators compared lending practices in white and non-white areas to look for disparities in how those people were treated. Those disparities were then compared to peer lenders in the same geographic area. As long as a lender was no more discriminatory than their peers, the case was dropped. Imagine that. Oh, Bank of America, you're discriminating. Well, let's check out BMO Harris Bank. Oh, they're discriminating at the same level. Oh, Wells Fargo, the same level. Oh, you're good. You're not any worse than anybody else, so you're good. And this is actually what happened from the 1960s all the way through the mid-2000s. They were okay with that. Imagine that. They're saying, okay, you're discriminating, but you're not the only one, so, we'll leave you alone. After the Obama administration took over, they no longer benefited from peer comparison analysis, and they focused on whether lenders lend on an equal basis in non-white and white areas. So they began to shift the way they looked at these significantly. And I was really shocked when I saw that they basically gave these companies permission to discriminate as long as their peers were doing the same thing. They began to discount property based on racial composition, and this was policy around the country until 1977. Till 1977, this is perfectly okay. And the Federal Housing Administration and HUD were okay with it. They allowed professional associations and real estate appraisers to write standards that expressly discounted property values based on the racial composition of a property's neighborhood. So they basically said, listen, you can evaluate those properties, appraise them at a lower price because it's black people living in that neighborhood. Oh, it's Latinos living in that neighborhood. So it's okay. Don't worry about it. They should be lower. And this was the case until 1977. And the Federal Housing Administration finally changed that policy, but it wasn't until 1977. there were some major redlining cases. 2 major cases were settled in 2015 for a combined $227 million in fines, restitution, and remedial measures. And then there was a couple big reverse redlining cases settled in 2011, 2012 for a combined total of $510 million. So this was the federal government, HUD, the Department of Justice coming in, filing claims, and forcing these institutions to pay for discriminating. One of those, Associated Bank. They settled a discrimination case with the Department of Justice for $200 million in May of 2015. Now, to their credit, they said, we didn't do it, but we'll settle anyway. We didn't do it, but we'll settle. We'll give $200 million away, because we didn't really do it. Because they knew they were caught red-handed, so they really didn't have a choice but to settle. And these are some of the details. Data from 2008 to 2010 showed that they had disparities of 20 to 31% for black applicants relative to similarly creditworthy white applicants. So huge, huge disparities. But it also impacted the Hispanic population, where the disparities were 7 to 16% greater for equally creditworthy Hispanics versus whites. And when people looked at the data, they were like, I mean, this is blatant discrimination. You can't explain, there's no way you can explain this away. It's obvious, and so they were forced to settle. There was a major shift in how credit worked. In the 1990s, we began to see this shift in the way lenders lent people buying homes. So they used, prior to the 1990s, what was known as credit rationing, where borrowers were simply denied credit. Okay, you don't have the credit worthiness, we're simply going to just turn you down. But what happens in the 1990s, they began to use this policy called risk-based pricing, where previously denied borrowers were offered more expensive loans to compensate for risk. So they said, we turned you down a couple of years ago, come back, we'll give you the loan, but we're going to charge you more money than we would charge somebody else with a better credit worthiness. So this began to spiral into reverse redlining. Leading up to the Great Recession, most national banks continued to underserve non-white communities, and short-term lenders and independent mortgage brokers came in and filled the void. And this is how many people of color were forced to buy their homes. They couldn't go to the big banks because they simply didn't do business in those neighborhoods. Countrywide and Wells Fargo were accused of reverse redlining. Countrywide settled for $335 million, and then Wells Fargo settled for $175 million. So Countrywide was in 2011, Wells Fargo was in 2012. So these were huge, huge settlements. Let's look at why they settled. Data from 2008 to 2010, oh, I put that one in twice. Let me skip this one. Countrywide and Wells Fargo, they used what was known as discriminatory pricing. So they established a system for pricing their loans which had the effect of charging more than 100,000 black and Hispanic borrowers higher fees than similarly creditworthy white borrowers. So these were policies they put in place intentionally to force black and Hispanics to pay more than whites. In addition to that, both banks established practices which resulted in over 10,000 Hispanic and black borrowers from across the country being given subprime loans when they were qualified for prime loans. And anyone who knows the difference knows you're going to pay a lot more money for a subprime loan than for a prime loan. And so whites who had the same credit worthiness and probably should have been eligible for a subprime loan got a prime loan instead. Many blacks and Latinos who had credit worthiness to get a prime loan were given a subprime loan instead by both of these banks. Non-white borrowers are more than 2.4 times more likely to receive subprime loans than white borrowers. Both banks established practices which incentivize mortgage underwriters to place applicants who qualify for prime loans into subprime loans. You incentivized it. You made it a bigger piece of the pie. You got a larger commission by getting somebody to sign on the dotted line for a subprime loan than a prime loan. So guess what people are going to do? They're going to push you into a subprime loan, okay? And this is exactly what both of these banks did. And they actually had these controls in the system that said, okay, based on these parameters, this is where the line is drawn between people who get subprime loans and people who get prime loans. So it was very clearly articulated. They actually put in a policy that allowed people to overwrite those standards. Imagine that. You have this standard to protect people from not getting a subprime loan who are eligible for a prime loan, and then you give these people permission to overwrite those standards. Why even have them if you're going going to allow people to override them. It makes no sense unless you're absolutely doing this intentionally to discriminate against people. Wells Fargo paid mortgage bankers commissions of 0.75 to 1.8% of total loan amounts for subprime loans and only 0.5% for prime loans. So an example of how this would benefit these people, possible commission on a $250,000 loan. For a prime loan, the commission will be $1,250. For a subprime loan, $4,500. Guess which one I want? And guess which one these bankers wanted? They were trying to get the bigger commission, and they did it on a regular basis, discriminating against people because it was a financial benefit to them. Wells Fargo illegally placed 4,000 Black and Hispanic customers into subprime loans. Countrywide placed over 10,000 Black and Hispanic customers into subprime loans, even though they were eligible for prime loans. And one of the things that really kind of just shows you how the discrepancy worked was to look at, whether people were more likely than equally creditworthy whites to receive subprime loans. So there are two markets that you can get loans through. So the regular market and then the secondary market. So for Wells Fargo, blacks are 5.6 times more likely to get, a subprime loan than whites were. Hispanics are 2.4 times more likely in the regular market. In the secondary market, blacks are 8.3 times more likely than whites to get a subprime loan, and Hispanics 1.7 times more likely to receive these subprime loans. In the regular market for countrywide, blacks are 2.1 times more likely. Latinos were 2.6 times more likely. And then in the secondary market, blacks are 2.7 times more likely, and Latinos 3.5 times more likely. So they discriminated against both groups, and it had a tremendous impact because we all remember the stories. When the housing bubble burst, these people got these loans and they couldn't afford those homes. Why did they buy them in the first place? They were living above their means. No, they weren't. They were being cheated on purpose, and they had no idea. How many of you could say that prior to the housing bubble bursting in 2008, 2009, had ever even heard of a subprime loan before? I see a couple hands. Most of us had never even heard of it. I was like, what is that? What's a subprime loan? But they were done on purpose. These people discriminated on purpose. They kept broker compensation for prime loans at 5% and subprime loans at 6%. That's a countrywide deal. They granted mortgage brokers the discretion to request exceptions to underwriting guidelines, just as Wells Fargo did. And by the end or early 2007, over half of certain loans were written with these exceptions in place. So they put the exceptions in, and they said, okay, go ahead and make that exception. And they did it on a regular basis. So this discrimination was absolutely phenomenal in terms of how explicitly they did it. So what I want to finish with is that these stories, understanding how these things work and the impact of these things, should be very clear that people of color and whites were not treated the same by these lending institutions. Redlining is much more than just these old maps from back in the 30s and 40s, that these policies continue unabated to this day, and for the most part, the federal government has done absolutely nothing about it. One of the best articles I've ever written is actually a series that ProPublica did, where they looked at how these things have played out over the course of time. And it's an absolutely phenomenal look at the specifics of how the federal government betrayed that law of 1968. If you have an opportunity to see that article, it's well worth your time to read it. And it really gives you an idea of how explicitly these things were done and how we continue to celebrate this law, but we really should not be celebrating it because it wasn't enforced. I tell people that we celebrate things without understanding the ramifications of them later. Another thing we're celebrating this year, the 50th anniversary of the Open Housing Marches in Milwaukee, right? I mean, that's part of what this series is about, and we're celebrating, and it was wonderful, and those people risked their lives, and it's great, but we have to look at the outcome. And I was fortunate enough, doing research for the hidden impact of segregation, to come across the fact that they did a special census in Milwaukee in 1975. And that special census showed me something that I was shocked to see. I had been led to believe that the open housing marches opened up the South Side for black people, right? I mean, that's what they were for. But they were also about opening up the North Side the black people will be able to move north to Capitol Drive. So what happens is when I looked at that special census in 1975, I looked specifically at neighborhoods on the south side of Milwaukee. I said, let me see how many black people are in those neighborhoods 8 years after the marches started. And what I found in most of those neighborhoods were single-digit numbers of black people. You may have had 30,000 white people in the neighborhood, but you had a total of like maybe 7 or 8 black people. So the open housing marches were impactful, obviously. They made a great deal of change in Milwaukee, but the change occurred mostly to the north and to the west. Black people did not move to the south side. They did not move to the east side. They moved north and west. So as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of that, let's be cognizant of the fact that when we look at those marches and we look at the images, we have to look at something and think about it in a different way. And this is what I tell people to do. When you look at the images from the open housing marches in Milwaukee, don't look at those people who are marching. Look at the counter-protesters. Look at these little white children with Nazi signs held above their heads. And ask yourself this question: where are they now? Who are they now? Are they could they possibly be your supervisor at work? Could they be the owner of the company that you work for? You don't know. But I guarantee you, if you ask them, they'll tell you, yeah, I was in support of those marches. Just like people tell you, yeah, I supported Dr. King back in the 50s and 60s. No, you didn't. He was the most hated man in America. We lie consistently because we have a lack of credible information. So the last thing I want to share with you is educate yourselves because our society refuses to do it. Thank you all so much.